Water Act for limits for radioactive iodine in drinking water, 3 picocuries per liter. And so in city after city, our rain was way over 47 compared to 3, for example, in Concord, New Hampshire. Let me find for you a California one, huh? How about Richmond? Do we have Richmond here? Okay, Richmond, California. Oh, Richmond's not so high on this one, so hang on a second. Portland was high. Different dates. Well, I can't find California for the moment, but these are way over the safe drinking water levels. Portland, as you see, 86.8. St. Paul, 32. So thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from Japan, radioactivity was falling out here in the United States, measurable in our rainwater at levels far above the Safe Drinking Water Act levels. So I'm going to skip this. This has to do with efforts by our country, our government, to relax the safe drinking water level standards by often orders of magnitude. And here is a chart which we'll come back to in a second, and come back now to Japan. The amount of radioactivity released in Japan and well outside of the evacuation zone is so high that there's been concern for children playing in playgrounds at schools. The amount of cesium-137, that powerful gamma emitter, for example, that's fallen out in many of these playgrounds is so high that children playing in them would quickly exceed the permissible level of radiation for a child. So the Japanese authorities decided to relax the standard. They were going to move it up from 100 millirem a year, which is still very high. That's about 20 chest x-rays. Think about it, sending your kid to school and every other week getting a chest x-ray without there being any medical reason or any film in the machine. They wanted to increase it to 2 rem a year, 20-fold increase. Now, the National Academy of Sciences estimate of what 2 rem in 1 year will do to a young girl is that approximately 1 in every 100 girls will get cancer from that radiation. That was the acceptable standard that was being proposed by the Japanese authorities. There was an outcry, and supposedly the Japanese government backed off of that. But in fact, there's a lot of ambiguity in their backing off, and they're faced with a terrible problem. So much of the country is now contaminated at levels that are above normal permissible radiation standards that either you have to remove extraordinary amounts of soil, and what do you do with it? Or you have to relax standards and have people be exposed year after year after year to contamination levels that one knows are going to produce substantial increases in cancer. And remember that the problem is not just schoolyards. It's not like it fell on schoolyards and didn't fall anywhere else. It fell on all sorts of agricultural lands. So there have been scandal after scandal where beef was checked with a Geiger counter, which can't really tell you anything, and then slaughtered, and they measured the meat, and the meat had cesium or strontium or iodine levels that were way unacceptable. Rice being contaminated, fish, of course, being contaminated. I told you that the radiation levels in the ocean were at times 1 million times permissible levels. The authorities said, don't worry about the fish. We have declared the area off of Fukushima off limits for fishing. Well, that's really fine if the fish know how to read the notice. I mean, right, if there's a line they're not supposed to swim beyond. And radioactivity has a tendency to bioaccumulate, which means it gets more concentrated as it goes up the food chain. So the primary risk is over the long term drinking contaminated water, drinking contaminated milk, consuming contaminated foodstuffs, and inhaling contaminated air. It's a disaster beyond comprehension. The tiny bit you personally may have gotten worried about here in the United States when you saw those levels, these are trivial, what we had in our rainwater compared to what's been going on in Japan. But I wanted you to understand that we all live in Fukushima. The nuclear world is one world. What happens in one part of the world affects the entire world. And the tragedy that the Japanese are experiencing is a tragedy that is not entirely of their own making. We helped bring it to them by this illusion that you can somehow make the atom into something other than what it is, which is an instrument of tremendous destruction. Let me try to conclude with a message as to what it is that makes sense to do, and it fits very well with what the film was that you've just seen. Our world and our generation face two immense crises of a level that has never occurred in world history. We have an opportunity to address them and a responsibility to do so because this moment in history is the moment in which there either will be survival of our species and other species, or there won't be. It's an extraordinary thing to say. In previous generations, you could cause damage and kill thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. You could damage a piece of the environment, but you couldn't damage the whole world. What we are doing by burning fossil fuels and melting the ice caps and raising the level of the oceans and creating situations of famine and drought throughout the world will create a world in which no one can recognize. The level of destruction from global warming is hard to imagine. But on top of that is the risk from the atom. The world has about 26,000 nuclear weapons. It takes about 100 to destroy a large country as a functioning society. A few hundred or a few thousand of them can produce a global a nuclear winter. It is inconceivable that we as a species can continue to exist for long periods of time and tens of thousands of nuclear weapons without them going off. And going off again, and not just two nuclear weapons, just. Think about the destruction that just two small weapons did in Japan in 1945. And think of tens of thousands, and think of most of them being hundreds of times larger, many of them hundreds of times larger than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We as a species and the species that depend upon us cannot survive indefinitely with that number of nuclear weapons. And every nuclear power plant produces enough plutonium every year for 100 additional nuclear weapons. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. It's not going away. So if we don't solve the problem of global warming, we're going to melt the planet. And if we don't solve the problem of the atom, we're going to blow it up. And ironically, the people who are pushing nuclear power are trying to piggyback on the risk of global warming by saying we need nuclear reactors because of global warming. The reality is just the opposite. We only have so many resources. And if you dump those resources down the rat's hole of nuclear power, you won't have the money that you need to have photovoltaics and solar thermal and wind and biomass and all of the other renewables that are safe and sustainable and don't lead to war and terrorism. So there is a brief moment of history in which we can learn the lesson that Japan has in its own body tissue been forced to learn. And maybe the tragedy that began with Hiroshima can end with the tragedy of Fukushima. That maybe those can be the bookends to this terrible detour that we as a species took. And we can move to the only safe nuclear reactor there is, one that has a 93 million mile exclusion zone, the sun. It shines on all of us, whether deserving or not. And we are fools not to tap it. But worse than being fools, we are complicit, if we don't act, in the destruction of life as we know it on this planet. Because if we don't solve the global warming problem and don't solve the nuclear problem, there isn't going to be a world that we can recognize. So let me end by saying that history, we are often told, is written by the victors. It's not really true. Even the defeated often get to write the history. The people who really write the history are either the 1% or the people who are working for the 1%. But history is made by the 99%. It's made by the villagers in that film who were prematurely right. We need to join them because it's not just our own survival that's at stake, but generations that have no say in the matter, haven't been born yet. So the 99% make history. The common people make history. The villagers make history. And if we don't make history, it may well be the end of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I feel so sorry that because this accident happened in Japan, and I think it's Japanese people's responsibility. It's my own responsibility also. And yeah, so I think the distance has no meaning about nuclear accident. So next speaker is Shingo 2. Could you?
Yes.
Please. You speak here?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Shingo Anen. I go by the artist name Shingo 2. And, well, in interest of time, since I actually, we actually might get to some pictures, but I have been giving out lectures just like the two speakers before me, and sometimes they go on for about 2 hours. And they already gave a lot of great information. So I think I would just start off just sharing some of my personal experiences, like why I'm sitting here and why you guys are sitting here. Well, where to begin? But yeah, well, I really liked Daniel. I'm sorry, excuse me. My mother makes the same mistake. Okay. Sorry about that. Daniel's speech, that he tied it in all together because, well, through my experience of learning and studying and reading and also sharing with people my age and some much younger and some older, you really have to put things in perspective. Whether that perspective means your personal surrounding or your community or your country or your history in terms of, you know, your lifespan. Sometimes it could mean decades. Sometimes it could actually mean centuries, or in the context of talking about genetics and Earth's environment, you're talking about millions of years now, sometimes billions of years. And it all counts, right? Because we're here in 2011, but we are the result of billions of years of evolution, and we can't rewind that. What's in our body and what constitutes our health and our well-being, our life cycle, everything, in environment, atomic structure, molecular structure, it's all a result of constant improvement by, you could call it natural selection, but there is a cause and an effect, and there is a reason for everything. Nothing exists without reason, in my opinion. So you could really break down this situation of nuclear energy in many different ways. You could talk about the economics, you could talk about the politics. You really have to weigh everybody's opinion, because everybody has some kind of valid point. And I have to be my own devil's advocate to really understand why people make the statements they do, even if they're government officials or corporate spokesperson or lawyers, what have you. Because otherwise, you really wouldn't know where to begin, and you don't know who to believe. Because obviously we understand certain things, and it's very easy to access information. Even if you don't get it on textbooks or the internet, you can go to the library and it's out there. But you have to organize the infinite amount of information. Some are purely academic, is very hard to decipher, but there are people that would explain that for you, experts that could break down the problem for you. But you really have to weigh the cost and the benefit, such as nuclear technology. But when you're talking about the energy issue, just as Daniel said, you have to weigh the cost and the benefit for natural gas. Right now, that's a huge problem in the United States with renewed interest in fracking, and you could just about argue against anything. There's a great documentary about why tap water is much better than bottled water and plastics getting into our body. You know what I mean? Like, there's infinite amount that you could argue for or against, but such is the nature of the issue that we have at hand. So we have to kind of get that into our heads before we talk specifically about this one thing that could possibly well be affecting every aspect of our lives. So having said that, the reason I'm sitting here is because I'm a musician by trade, but I also attended UC Berkeley as an engineering student. And while actually I was already a graduate when I came across photographs of a wonderful Japanese photographer named Takashi Morizumi, and he had an exhibit about the children in Iraq suffering from depleted uranium contamination, and I had no idea what DU really was. And then I came across her first film called Hibakusha, which was supported by the same people that put on the show, put on the exhibit at a public library in Berkeley. So I became involved with her first film in a very limited capacity. I did some translations. And by the time her second film rolled around, it was 2006, she was doing the Rokkashomura Rhapsody. I became involved in a music project led by a man named Ryuichi Sakamoto. He's a world-renowned Academy Award-winning composer. So we actually held a open source creative project where people could chip in music and remixes of stems that we released to raise awareness about the reprocessing center. So it was at this time where I thought, wow, you know, we're talking about the dangers of reprocessing spent nuclear fuel, but maybe the reason the reason that we have such a big problem is the fact that we are producing all these spent nuclear, basically batteries, from these nuclear power plants that are scattered all over Japan. And the film you just saw today is a great example of what has been happening for decades. This is a great archive of something that is going on right now to this day, but the exact same situation repeated many, many times for those 50 to actually be constructed. It's not as if those 54 were built without a fight. There were people that put up a fight and tried to stop the construction, but to no avail. And thus we have 100 reactors in the United States and roughly over 50 in Japan. So that was 2006, and then I ventured to research on my own that I should have somewhat of an informed opinion about nuclear energy So I started interviewing scientists and activists who were somewhat affiliated with UC Berkeley. Some had worked at the Lawrence Livermore weapons lab or energy lab, whatever you like to call it. And one of them were Dr. Ernest Sternglass that I interviewed, and who wrote a book with Mr. Jay Gould about the effects of regular operations of nuclear power plants, let alone a catastrophic event that he had just described. Even during regular operations, these emissions through smokestacks and obviously the coolant that are pumped into the waterways, they're not perfectly clean. Even the noble gases, eventually they will settle down and decay into metals. So these are facts that are easily searchable, yet we have been kept in the dark about. And I remember even when I was in elementary school, I was about 4th or 5th grade, we would all get these pamphlets in Japan, and it said the passport for the 21st century. And it talked about all the benefits of nuclear energy, and it didn't talk about the risks. So you only see the benefits, you don't talk about the cost. And by cost, I don't mean just financially. It could very well mean your health. It could mean your mental health. It could be a philosophical, moral issue, what have you. So you really are now able to discover the good and the bad so that you can make more of a informed decision from a more or less interdisciplinary process. Yeah, for example, one YouTube that I just showed Hitomi is a film called Our Friend, the Atom by Walt Disney. I encourage you to go watch it on YouTube. It's narrated by Walt Disney himself, and it talks about the wonders of nuclear energy. This is back in 1957. This is right before commercial operations were really available in Japan. That didn't happen until the 60s. So it was during the transition that people started saying atoms for peace, and we could harness this wonderful energy to benefit mankind. But yeah, so
Ashes means it's extreme ashes human beings create is spent nuclear fuel. So we are burning, and human beings have been burning something to create our civilization. But it is not sustainable at all. So we need to really reverse a kind of way of support our life. But this is not just making ashes like burning oil or burning uranium. So like we need like a honey, sweet things, not destroy any environment which support life of us. This title that I put to this meaning. So this is not only energy, the way how we live, how we support this society, I think. It's kind of comprehensive issue, and also I think it's human matter. It's just not technology. I think it's our problem. That's how I think. So can we take questions?
yes, let me get and then make a concluding statement.
Yeah.
So actually, I really wanted to speak to you guys, so I might not just show the graphic. But so I would just like to make a point that you really have to discover what it is that makes sense to you, because we all have different approaches and values and different disciplines, whatever background you're from. But there will come a time when you will confront a piece of information that'll make so much sense to you that it kind of puts all the different pieces of the puzzle into one frame. that so that you could actually tell somebody, oh, this is what is happening. And that is by no means restricted to what we're talking about today about internal radiation. But in my experience, that has been the case. Like, you have to start asking why. Like, why is cesium important? You know, and then when you discover, oh, it is an alkali metal, it reacts with water, and it's going to get in your cells, boom, there's your answer. You can't just accept what somebody tells you. And there is a reasoning behind whatever phenomenon that's being described and discussed. So, yeah, I will encourage each and every one of you to go search and then go find the answer of your own, because nobody really has one particular answer that will describe everything. In case of radiation and effects of radiation, nobody can decide, oh, is 1 in 100 children getting cancer, is that okay? But what does that even mean? It just means that everybody is getting the same dose that would end up in 1 in 100 being affected because of their unique immune system that were not able to fend off the effects. Their safeguards did not make it. You know what I mean? So it's not just something that discriminates one and not